Good evening. My name is David Patterson. I have the great blessing of being a professor at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, and I'm here to welcome you to another keynote lecture. This one, we're very pleased to have Dr. Bernice Lerner with us, a senior scholar at the Center for Character and Social Responsibility, which is at Brown University. She's a former dean of adult learning at Hebrew College. Dr. Lerner will speak about the ethics of rescue and the stories behind the liberation of Bergen-Belsen tonight. On April 15th, 3 weeks before the World War II's end, the unit of British Second Army entered the then largest Nazi concentration camp, and you have that information about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in your program. Dr. Lerner will go into more details on the liberation, stories behind the liberation. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Bernice Lerner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson, and thank you so much to so many of the people who helped to make this conference run smoothly, to the people at the Ackerman Center, to Bonnie Gordon and Cynthia Seaton-Rogers, to Niels Romer, and to the University of Texas at Dallas for hosting us. It's a real privilege and an honor for me to be here. I have known about this, the annual Scholars Conference for years and years. I've always wanted to come, and I've never been able to, and to be invited to come to give a keynote is a humbling experience, and I'm very, very honored. So I'm here to talk to you about the ethics of rescue, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And I will tell you that the seeds of my research were planted more than 50 years ago. They were I can't tell you the exact date or even the season, but I can tell you the setting that they were planted. We were in the basement of my home. I was a young teenager, and my mom was ironing, and I used to always like to watch her. We had a crowded old basement. We had supplies of clothes and all kinds of things ringing the room, and it was kind of makeshift, but she's very comfortable with it. And we were in the laundry room, and as very often, we just talked about our days, and she always had a way of regaling me with stories about her past. Her childhood was in Transylvania, Romania when she was growing up, and she told me stories about her childhood. And then she had this entire post-war chapter in Sweden, so she always told me stories from Sweden, so it was all very exotic to me, right? It was in Long Island, right? So one night, she was talking to me, and I guess she must have subconsciously decided I was ready to hear it, and she was starting to tell me about Auschwitz and then about Bergen-Belsen. She had told me a little bit before, but I will never forget the night that she was telling me about, she was comparing the two horrific death camps, and I never thought of her as, my mother, a Holocaust survivor, right? The term Holocaust wasn't even in modern parlance at that time. It was just, this is what happened to my mother, my mother whom I loved, whom I admired for so many things. And this is just telling me about her past. And she went and she put down the iron, and she stretched out, she bent forward, and she kneeled forward, and she stretched out her arms behind her. And she demonstrated for me how she, who was 50% dead, dragged bodies, some still breathing, some 90% dead, to a mass grave in Bergen-Belsen. So that was, I think that's when I just started to, realize, where she had been. This was different than what other kids in my high school were hearing at home, right? So she had told me also some other things. She told me that she was taken to a makeshift hospital room, and there were 12 beds in the room. And every day for 3 weeks, they took out 11 dead and brought in 11 nearly dead. And she was in and out of consciousness. But slowly, after about 3 weeks, she began to come to more, and she would crawl out of her bed and crawl over to the night tables of those who had died and started to eat their food. So it was a process. She was very, very sick. So finally, 40 years later or so, I began to wonder, how was it that my mother got from point A to point B? How was it that she got to be she was in this terrible situation in Bergen-Belsen, and she was nearly dead. She was beaten to unconsciousness. She was actually beaten by her fellow inmates after the liberation to the point where she had fallen unconscious. How did she get from point A to the makeshift hospital room? And I started to research the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And you Google it, and what comes up most often is that the liberator most prominently associated with the liberation is this man called Glyn Hughes. So who was Glyn Hughes? So I started to dive into this man's background. I asked everyone who could have known him, who was alive, who I knew about, what did they think of him? Who was this man? How did he orchestrate the liberation? How did it all come to be? And I tracked down his daughter, who was still alive. He had died in 1973. I tracked down his daughter in England, and I went to visit her. And I went to visit some of his friends who, at the time, they were in their 80s. It was sort of a really like a last chance to sort of meet and talk with some people about Glyn Hughes. And I discovered this man who, by all accounts, I thought should be as well known as an Oskar Schindler, because he was just unique in the way he really empathized with survivors, really connected with them, and really saw them as part of his life. He maintained relationships with them, and he wanted them commemorated at his funeral, and he was a champion of the survivors, advocating for them in whatever ways he could, and by extension, the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So I endeavored to write about Glyn Hughes. And then what happened is people started saying, but what about your mother's story? What about your mother's story? So I wound up telling both of their stories, and I wrote a dual biography, and it was called All the Horrors of War. I have the images of the covers in both the US version and the UK version up here, because I think they show different things. It's just interesting. The publishers were furnished with the same photographs and the same text, but they came up with completely different concepts for the cover. But you can see my mother standing in the UK version in To Meet in Hell. That's her about 7 months after the war. And there she is in snowy northwest Sweden in the tuberculosis sanitarium. And you can see that she's nourished, and she no longer has scars, black and blue marks all over her, but she's really, really sick. She has TB. And you can also see sort of the look in her eyes. You know, you sort of think of the survivors being liberated as being really happy, but it was a very tragic and, thing for them. They had such great losses. And she had just turned 16 in this picture. And then, the top you could see the background of the sanatorium. And the bottom picture, here, and the top picture there, you see Glyn Hughes at his caravan in Bergen-Belsen. And he was very, very high up in the hierarchy. He was, at the time that they liberated, the British came upon the camp, he was the deputy director of medical services for the entire British Second Army. So he could have been working there. I found a lot of notes in his files. He could have been working up the different stages of diets, different diets you feed people in different stages of emaciation. He could be calling for help. He's working. Do you think this works? Okay. So how was I going to tell this dual biography? It would have been really romantic and could have made a nice fiction book if I had said that they met and he adopted her, he brought her back to London, he had this son the same age as her, which that was true. But that's not what happened. Maybe he laid eyes on my mother when he was inspecting the camp. Maybe he didn't. You have to realize there were 60,000 people in the camp that were dying, really very sick. So what I decided to do ultimately was to tell the story as sort of a race against time rescue story. Now I say this with a lot of trembling, really, trepidation, because obviously the race was lost for far too many thousand people. But in my mother's case, it was sort of a race against time rescue. And had the British liberators come into Bergen-Belsen just 1 or 2 days later, I wouldn't be here talking to you. She would not have survived. It was really close for a lot of people. And by the same token, had they come in earlier, more lives might have been saved. So every day meant so much. So what I did was I told the story over 1 year period. And so it's really about 4 seasons, starting from the very dramatic spring of 1944 through till the spring of 1945. Now, a lot happened in the lives of my 2 protagonists before the spring of 1944. And I talk a little bit about that in the prologue, especially in my mom's case. But I couldn't get into all the details I had written earlier. I had to scrap chapters when I thought of writing it differently. But in the end, it was a 1 year story. And in the spring of 1944 is when the Jews from my mother's hometown were deported to Auschwitz, and the spring is when the British were preparing for their invasion of Normandy on D-Day. So the 4 seasons and the 5th season, the point of convergence, are sandwiched in between a few paragraphs about the Belsen trial, which was really significant, and most people haven't heard about it or thought much about it. You've all heard of the Nuremberg trials. I don't know how many people have heard of the Belsen trial. So the Belsen trial immediately preceded the Nuremberg trials, started on September 17th, 1945, ended right before the Nuremberg trials on November 17th, 1945. And it was the first trial that applied international law to war crimes. And Glyn Hughes was the first witness. So there's just some really astounding facts about that trial that I wanted to talk about. And you can see I have that Army Talks magazine from November 1945. That is a picture of the Lüneburg courtroom. Lüneburg is north of Bergen-Belsen, and this is in a converted gymnasium, and they had this makeshift kind of courtroom. And they put on trial 45 of I want to get the number right also, so I just want to check. There were more than 480 functionaries at the Bergen-Belsen camp, and they put only 45 on trial. So talking about, there was a session earlier today about Nazis escaping judgment. Well, there were a lot of Nazis who got off scot-free right in Germany right after the war. And so they put 45 on trial. They left 80. 80 had been remained in the camp during the turnover, when the British turned the camp over. The Germans turned the camp over to the British. But the small picture on the bottom right, I just pulled that out. That's Irma Gracie, number 9. And I talk a little bit about her in the book because she was just, the journalist just couldn't get enough of talking about this young, beautiful, blonde beast who was very sadistic. She was in charge of like 18,000 women in Auschwitz, and she was very brutal, and she was killed, beheaded at age 22. So this is really the journey of my protagonists. My mom is coming from the east to the west. She starts out in Sickened on the bottom right, and Glyn Hughes is coming from England, from the west to the east, and then they reach the point of convergence in this death camp, Bergen-Belsen, the victim and the liberator. And I tell the larger history is told, what happened to them happened to so many other people, right? But I focus on the individual and telling the story, telling it from their point of view. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just tell you about a couple of points on this timeline. I'm going to tell you just a word or two about where they each started out. I'm going to tell you what happened on June 6th, 1944, the day of the Allied invasion of Normandy, and then I'm going to focus on Bergen-Belsen and talk about the ethics of the liberation. The ethics of rescue. So it started out for Glyn Hughes in the Yorkshire Wolds in northeastern part of England, which was this beautiful area that had rose to a steep cliff and then dropped off. And it resembled, the reason that the British Second Army was practicing there was because it resembled the topography in Normandy. Now, at this point in the war, Glyn Hughes was Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Army's 8th Corps. He was not yet in charge of the entire Second Army, but the 8th Corps was going to go on to see the most terrible fighting. They were up against the most virulent, vicious panzer troops in Normandy, and they, as much as they practiced, and it was practice setting up casualty clearing stations, regimental aid posts, how fast could you do it, and what had to be moved from place to place. Still, it was really challenging when they got there, especially the soldiers who were fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy. And there was a lot of casualties. And my mom started out in this town in Transylvania called Sickened, which when she was growing up, it was Romania, and then at the time of the war, it was Hungary. The Hungaries occupied it in 1940. So there's a map you can see on the top left map how close it was to Ukraine. And in fact, now even like a few days ago, there was 7 miles of refugees from the Ukraine trying to get into Sickened. And it's a poor town. I mean, it's a poor town, but I think that what I'm hearing from all over, wherever the refugees are going, is people are trying really hard to give humanitarian aid. And I want to say just a word about Ukraine, because I don't know about you, but it's so much on my mind. I mean, I'm glued to the television, and it's just heartrending. And one of the reasons is because it is so well covered. Where do we get to see President Zelensky appeal to the world? You feel his emotion, you feel his fatigue every day as you hear him as the time goes on. And you just are, and then they are also interviewing people, mothers with children, with babies. They're going into hospitals, and it is a horror, and we're able to feel it. It's so immediate because of this access, this media access, which obviously during the war, there was nothing like this. You couldn't appeal to the humane people in the war around the world to help in whatever way they could, to send money, to send whatever they can collect. You couldn't appeal to them because it wasn't being shown. Everything was done in the greatest secrecy. So that's a sort of a striking difference to me between then and now. And of course, I'm thinking also all the time about, wow, how lucky, how amazing that we're able to be here to sit in this conference room, right? Didn't Michael Barenbaum just tell us that he had to cancel his trip to Babin Yar? I mean, how blessed we are, and how people are living in real fear and can't go on with their lives as usual. So that is just on my mind. So about this town of Sickened, you can see on the top right that it was in this territory that went back and forth. And for my mom, it was kind of, you can imagine, I mean, the benefit is that all these people who live in this area speak many languages. My mother actually went to Romanian school until she was 10 years old. When the Hungarians came in and they dismissed all the Romanian teachers, brought in the Hungarian teachers, you were fined if you spoke a word of Romanian. So you learned other languages very quickly, and I'm told that's good for your brain. So. This is the bottom picture is like from a postcard of Sickened before my mom was born, maybe my grandparents' time. And it's just a very beautiful town. I had the good fortune of being able to visit it just before the pandemic. And it just has a really nice layout with a big town square and main streets on either side. And of course, the mountains haven't moved. The town looks different, but the mountains haven't moved. So when I was there, I just tried to sort of even calculate how far it was, the distance my mom had to walk with her family to the train station when they were taken out of Siget. So we have not a single photograph of my mother's family, of my mother from her childhood, nothing. She was too sick after the war to even go, she was 15 years old, she didn't even think of going back. And it's kind of sad because she remembers that her family did send some wedding photographs to relatives in the United States. But when she wrote to them and asked if they could find any photographs, she never heard back from them. So we don't have a single image. I don't know what my grandparents looked like, but what we have was in my mom's memory. And so she drew this map at one point on the lower right of her street. And when I went back to visit, even though the street names have changed, for me, she lived between Timar Utsa and Kigyo Utsa. And Kigyo Utsa was Snake Street, and Timur Utsa was the Jewish street, and it was sort of an alleyway between these two, and she had a small apartment. But Elie Wiesel's house was at the top right part of the map, just like a 3-minute walk from my mom's house. So now another marker on the timeline, June 6, 1944, D-Day, the day that 150,000 Allied soldiers came over in 7,000 boats for this magnificent invasion, this armada of troops coming over, landing on 5 beaches. And in my book, I talk a lot about, you could see Bayeux there, Cannes. These are places where Glyn Hughes had to operate. He came over on the 6th day after D-Day and had to think about medical rescue. Now, the remarkable thing is that on this day, less than half the number of Allied soldiers were killed than on this day the number of civilians deported to Auschwitz were killed. So, and moreover, the number of Allied soldiers killed, which was terrible, terrible deaths, casualties, in the subsequent days fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy were high, but they were lower every day than they were on D-Day, whereas the number was either maintained or increased in Auschwitz until July 9th, when the Hungarian deportation slowed. So just so you, in case you don't know, my mom's transport was considered part of the Hungarian deportation, and that was the last unmolested mass of Jews in Eastern Europe to be touched by Hitler. And also the largest number were killed in the shortest possible time in the most mechanized ways. That more than 434,000 Jews were killed from the Hungarian provinces. So it was all very shocking, happened rapid fire fast, a lot of preparations for it in Auschwitz, including a new railway built into Birkenau, an extension of the railway. So these images were taken, these are the only images that exist. 193 to be exact, images exist that are part of this photo album that was taken by one of 2 SS men who had another assignment. They were taking photo IDs for the Nazis, but if you haven't heard of it, it's called the Auschwitz album. So these photos are from the Auschwitz album. These are people who are being deported. They're from either late May or early June of 1944, and they're from one of the towns not far from my mom. I think most of them are from Bergen-Belsen. And the photographers document the entire process of killing up until the gas chamber. You don't see what's happening there. But if you look closely and zoom in, probably if you took a magnifying glass, you can see a lot of human interaction and a lot of angst and worry. Like even if it looks organized in the bottom photo where the men are on one side and the women and children on the other, you can look closely and people are talking to each other and they're trying to figure it out. Like even the mother on the left is probably maybe even trying to comfort a child, and they're trying to figure out, where have we landed? Like, what is this place? Like, where are we? And that's after a long journey on a cattle train. Just here are some other photos from the Auschwitz album that are just extraordinary. You see the men in the striped, what looks like striped pajamas, maybe who were there a little bit longer, and Auschwitz, maybe coaching like Elie Wiesel was coached when he got off the train. Say you're older than you are. Tell the men younger that they are. Whispering to a young mother with a child, give the baby to the grandmother. Maybe you'll have a chance, and people didn't know what it meant. And here you see the top photo is just heartbreaking, and I tremble showing it to you, but I think it shows like the people who were selected for the gas chamber, the older grandmothers and the children, and then the people, the young women there selected to work temporarily, and what that meant, because there was a tug of war at Auschwitz at the time, because some SS, the SS maybe wanted to kill the largest number of Jews right away, whereas some people from the industries and Hitler also felt like we're losing the war, we need people in factories, we need free, disposable slave labor. So some were siphoned off to work. And on the right side, you see something that I think probably there could be a whole book about it, about the plunder, about what was stolen, like the economics of genocide, like all the things that were taken away, and here they are being sorted. And the inmates who worked there named the place where they did the sorting Canada, right? Because Canada is a vast continent. So, as the battles were raging, we're getting closer, I just wanted to point out some things from Glyn Hughes's archives. So if you were to go to the Museum of Military Medicine in England now, you would find boxes and boxes of this man who rose to be in a very high, important military position. And here, he was a real stalwart for organization. And that's really important to my story, because here he is, like at the bottom you could see, he has this chart, D+1, D+2, D+3. That means D-Day plus 1 day, D-Day plus 2 day. Everything was around D-Day. And how many arrived at the Neptune Beach casualties, and how many drowned, and how many survived, and how many were wounded. And he's trying to figure out how to get them the ones who were still alive, the best medical care. You see his list of general hospitals as he's fighting in the different areas and how many beds they have. And on the right, you could see the special units that had to be brought in, the neurosurgical units, maxillofacial surgical units. And everything was so planned out. In the chaos of war, every detail was attended to. So even surgeries were mapped out to 42 minutes, 34 seconds. I mean, it was just everything was just militarized and very organized. And here's some other photos from just taken from his album, showing sort of a battle scene on the bottom left in Lingen as they cross over the Rhine. And as they cross over in the Rhine, the middle photo is German soldiers waving white flags, surrendering to the British soldiers, and some of the scenes of the liberation as they're coming through various towns, and some signs that also show sort of British humor. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Like the top, between these points your enemy lies, and he, like you, can use his eyes. So show no light and he won't get wise. Things like that. That's very British to me. And I just want to point out to you, because now I'm going to talk to you about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So I just want to point out something striking to you, which is that the UN General Council chose January 27th, 1945 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that is the day that Auschwitz was liberated. And we know, right, that 1.1 million people were killed in Auschwitz. More were killed there than any other place. But by the time the liberators, the Red Army, came into Auschwitz, there were not that many. I mean, it was the end of January. The middle of January, they marched 60,000 inmates out of that camp on death marches, started them out on death marches. So there were fewer than 8,000 people remaining in the camp. Still a lot of stories, but it was not the biggest liberation in a way. And this is a map. You could just see Auschwitz I, and Auschwitz II is about 2 miles north, and Auschwitz III, Auschwitz-Buna, which means synthetic rubber, was about 4 miles away. So in those 3 parts of the complex, you can see it totals less than 8,000 people remaining on January 27th. And then they set out they forced the people on these death marches either due west or northwest. And as they were marching them, something like 714,000 people were put on these death marches toward the end of the war, the winter, mostly February, March 1945. And they really wanted to march them away from the Allied forces, from the Red Army. They did not want them to be liberated. The idea was that no one should be left alive in Allied hands. So out of the 714,000 who were on the death march, more than 1/3 died on the way of hunger, starvation, not having adequate clothing, just exhaustion. They were really, really death marches, and my mom was on one of them, and as you could see, they went different places, they picked up different people along the way, and deep, deep in northwest Germany is the camp of Bergen-Belsen, and they were deposited, some were taken to different places, but the largest number were taken to Bergen-Belsen. The largest number were found there toward the end of the war, on April 15th, 1945. Now, April 15th, 1945 was 3 weeks before Victory in Europe Day. And the fact that this camp was turned over from the Germans to the Allied forces, to the British Second Army, is really a stranger than truth story. It just wasn't in the plan. And Heinrich Himmler, who was so proud of the killing of the Einsatzgruppen, of killing Jewish families in 1941, who bragged to Hitler, who in 1942 went to Auschwitz and said the gas chambers were not working efficiently enough, and this change needed to happen, and that change needed to happen. It was too makeshift. Heinrich Himmler, who ordered the building of the camps, the Operation Reinhard camps, Sobibor and Treblinka and Belzec. This Heinrich Himmler, who on April 4th issued an order to the commanders of Flossenburg and Dachau that no inmate was to be turned alive over to the Allied forces, on April 11th decided to turn Bergen-Belsen over to the British. And it involves SS visiting the camp and reporting to him, but it also involves a story involving his masseuse, which is, it's just like stranger than truth. Truth is stranger than fiction. Anyway, so he decides he's going to hand the camp over. On April 12th, there is a truce. There's a meeting between British generals and German generals, and they decide, they draw up a truce, and they say that danger typhus zones have to be erected all around the area. There's going to be 80 SS in the camp remaining for the handover. There's going to be a certain number, several hundred of Hungarian soldiers who were overseers at the camp at the time of the handover. So I'm going to show you some photos now of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and I just want to say that it was the most documented liberation in the history of the war, certainly. So there were more than 200 photos taken. There were many rolls of film that were kept secret for political purposes. It was very well documented. The photographers, some of them really suffered from taking these pictures. Some swore off photography forever after. Some went numb. They were not used to filming these kinds of scenes that you're about to see. And I tremble showing you these, but I will, because I'm going to try to explain some things behind them. So you see, remember I opened up by telling you about my mom's story to me, the moment when the seed was planted. That is the middle of the road bisecting the horror camp where she had to drag corpses. And This is at the time of the liberation. It looks very desolate here, but there's 3 camps I think on the left and 2 on the right, separated by women and men. And there was 2 camps at Bergen-Belsen, I should say. Camp 1 was the horror camp, where there was about 40,000 people, and Camp 2 was also a terrible place, but people there didn't get the deadly typhus germ. They might have been emaciated, but they weren't as sick, and there were more recent arrivals from the death marches were in Camp 2, and there was maybe 20,000 people there. So here are some photos of the horror camp. So you can see on the top left that the British Tommies, the soldiers, are pressing the German Nazis who remain in the camp into helping clean up the camp, because, as I mentioned, my mom was on this duty where she had to clean up, right? So she had to drag skeletons to a mass grave, and there were just piles of dead all around. And the idea of using inmates to clean up the camp fell apart after a few days because they kept dying on the job. So anyway, they had these mass graves that they dug out with huge bulldozers. They're huge pits. They're like 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, 30 to 40 feet long. And here you see Rabbi Leslie Hardman on the left, and he's just bereft at the way people are being buried in this way. And there is, if you were to go to Bergen-Belsen today, they have a very nice, they have a very good exhibit now. After the episode with Reagan and Bitburg, which I'm not going to get into, they decided they have to really make it more educational and meaningful. So they have a really nice exhibit. And you'll go on the premises, you'll see this beautiful tombstone for Margot and Anne Frank. Well, someone tried to trace it and figure out where to put it, but that is not where they are buried. They are in one of these mass graves, along with my mother's cousin and so many thousands of other people. There were 15 of these mass graves. And on the upper right, you'll see a picture, and that I included because it shows a girl or teenager or woman with a square cut out of the back of her coat. And it just reminded me that those who were taken to slave labor camps, very often, they got shipments of some of the clothes that were taken away from people in Auschwitz, and they cut squares out of the back of their coats, lest they try to escape from the camp or on the death march. They should be easily identifiable as halfling. And on the bottom right, you see a marker of grave. This is grave number 2, 5,000. Now, if you would go there today to Bergen-Belsen, they have beautiful monuments at each of these 15 graves. And some say 2,000, some say 5,000, some say 10,000. And I can tell you that it was guesswork. They really don't know the precise number. So here are some scenes of the squalor in the camp. You can see on the right, here are these women who are cooking potatoes that were found. This is after the liberation, remember, and they are completely inured to the background. And from everything I've read by any liberator or any survivor, that the photos really can't show it and you can't smell it, but you had to have been there to really understand and what it was like. My mother even told me that night in the laundry room, she said no film or photograph can capture it. So there's some significant things that mean nothing to anybody else but to me, maybe to my mom. But here is when on the 3rd day after the liberation, and it took a while. You have to realize the liberation was a process. It wasn't like the liberators came in, the sun was shining, the sky was blue, people were cheering. It was not that way at all. It was a really long process. And it took about 3 days for the British Light Field Ambulance to come into the camp and pitch a dump of tentage to get people out of the dung-infested huts. They called those structures huts. And there were dead and living occupying the same space. They were very overcrowded. So to get some of the people who could still walk who are ambulatory get out, go intense, so we can maybe get a sip of water to somebody who's laying there in the hut. So my mom there's a story about my mom, and where she was okay enough to go into a hut, and then she got really sick, and she had to crawl back to, she was okay enough to go into a tent. She got really sick and was forced to crawl back to the hut, so she had to crawl back. So that's why the distance is meaningful for me. And it was in the hut that she was beaten up by her fellow inmates to unconsciousness. And the liberation, I want you to realize, is also really complicated. It's not like what you think of as a liberation. There's so many things that you don't even think about. Like before the SS left, they sabotaged the water and the electricity. So the Royal Engineers had to pump in water from a nearby lake or wherever they got it from. And the other picture on top right is Glyn Hughes, or had the burgermeisters, the mayors, come in from the neighboring areas to come see what their compatriots had wrought. And there you see the same thing on the bottom, villagers coming to see what it was like. So the rescue. So this was really, really hard to figure out. And I can tell you that Brigadier Glyn Hughes, who was, as I mentioned, a stalwart for preparedness. Everything with him was structured, prepared, military, on time. He broke down crying when he came into Bergen-Belsen. When he first came in, which was on the first day of the liberation, he broke down crying because he had no idea how he was going to go about trying to save lives. There was no order. It was just chaos and horror and disease. At least 3 epidemics were raging in the camp. There was typhus, there was tuberculosis, and there was gastroenteritis, and there was like every other disease, and there were these contagions. And they were fighting. They were still fighting in Northwest Germany. There were still battles going on. He still had to treat the soldiers who were being wounded. So it was a very complicated thing. So they very quickly decided on this way of trying to give the most people a chance at living, which was a triage system, and they set up this human laundry. So on the left, the top left, you see men of the light field ambulance dressed in, well, I don't know, hazmat suits. I don't know what you would call them, but they're in protective clothing, right? So they are from head to toe, and they're loading inmates from the huts that were identified by, like, a medic went in and identified the ones that they thought had a chance of life by marking their foreheads with, like, a piece of red chalk. And then these guys went into the huts and took those people into these contaminated ambulances to a transformed cavalry stables about 1.5 miles away to what they called the human laundry. They set up this human laundry with 60 tables, and they had, they didn't have enough person power, so they took German nurses from the area who had to wash these inmates and spray them all with DDT. And afterwards, they had to find for them wrap the naked bodies clean now in clean blankets and take them in a clean ambulance to a makeshift hospital area. So there's a picture of the human laundry, and you can imagine how some of these inmates felt being handled by German nurses. It was very scary for them. So here's just some approximate numbers. I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the bottom. So, by the way, the hospital on the premises of Bergen-Belsen was named the Glyn Hughes Hospital. And that was another sort of tip-off for me that this man was significant, because the survivors were so taken with him, with his warmth, his caring, and his efforts, that they chose to name the hospital the Glyn Hughes Hospital. 14,000 patients were in the Glyn Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe and maybe the world, on May 19th, 1945. That's 1 month, like a little over 1 month after the liberation. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried in Bergen-Belsen. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. That is that shows you just how unimaginable the situation was and how sick people were. 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen 2 days after the liberation, and 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry, the place for washing and disinfecting survivors. So do you remember how I told you that my mom she told me that she was taken to this makeshift hospital room, and every day 11 people died. There were 12 beds, and every day they brought in 11 nearly dead, and she was the one who was just hanging on, didn't want to die. Well, by her telling me that made me realize that she must have been one of the first people to be evacuated of the 750 to 1,000 processed each day for over 3 weeks, because she remembered for 3 weeks they were bringing in people. And just one more, 25,000 fit, the survivors who were able to walk, who suffered from various stages of emaciation, who were transferred to the formerly Wehrmacht Transit and Rehabilitation Barracks. You were deemed okay if you could walk up 2 steps. If you could walk up 2 steps, you were taken to this area, which was the start of what would become the displaced persons camp. Now, of course, it was very fungible. There were people who were thought to be okay at the time of the liberation who wound up back in the hospital, back and forth. So finally, the rescue started, really got underway 1 week after the liberation on April 23rd, and it ended on May 21st. So just to let you know, of course, the Victory in Europe Day was May 8th, but Glyn Hughes would not allow the Union Jack, the British flag, to be hoisted on May 8th. He just wanted it to be done when their work at Bergen-Belsen was done. And when their work at Bergen-Belsen was done, there was a big ceremony where they burned down, as each hut was evacuated, they burned it down. And on May 21st, they had a ceremony where they burned down the last hut. And there you see, he gave the order. There's Glyn Hughes on the bottom, middle, he's profile. And he gave the order for the firing of the blasts of fire to burn down this hut with an effigy of Hitler on it, and you see British soldiers and displaced persons, DPs, survivors of the camp, coming to see the ceremony and hear the speech. And there's the biggest part of the Glyn Hughes Hospital is on the bottom right, and there's a sign on the top right. So this moment that the hospital at Bergen-Belsen was burned down was very significant, and this little country off the coast of Sri Lanka, the Maldives, decided to commit, for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they issued these commemorative stamps, and one of them was of the burning down of the hut. You could see the top picture is the one that is copied for the bottom for the stamp. So the ethics of rescue. So I'm just going to talk for a minute about that. So I identified just a few things having to do with the ethics of rescue. Of course, there were many more, but they were part of the story of why I chose to write about Glyn Hughes. So he was, to me, sort of an outstanding character for lots of reasons, but one was the moral motivation, and this was discerned right away by the inmates. Hardened soldiers and officers wept, vomited, and cursed upon confronting the never-imagined depth of human depravity. Feeling hopeless, wondering how he would even begin to set in motion the machinery which might save as many lives as possible, Hughes, from the outset, was determined to find a way. And he called for help from experts and pressed into service any able assistance, including survivors who had any medical knowledge and German doctors and nurses. And he just wanted to give the best chance of survival to the greatest number, which honestly, I mean, he couldn't 100% do, and he lived with that for the rest of his life. And I'll talk a little bit about his post-war life and what he did with it. But it certainly gave my mother and 4 of my aunts a chance of survival. Readiness to break rules. Hughes did not wait for approval from 2nd Army headquarters. Arguing that the dictates of humanity required quick action, he diverted resources and personnel despite competing needs. And he just knew when he couldn't wait for approval. This was very out of the ordinary. He knew there would be concentration camps. They knew that, but they did not expect anything like Bergen-Belsen, and he just acted quickly. Resourcefulness. At evening meetings, Hughes every evening, the British medical personnel got together for these evening meetings, deciding what to do. He weighed in on seemingly insurmountable problems. When the rescuers ran out of blankets to wrap around inmates stripped of lice-infested clothing, it seemed that evacuation from the horror camp to the hospital might be delayed. Hughes directed a lieutenant colonel to approach the Burgermeister of Celle, the nearest town, demanding, as per his orders, that each civilian hand in 1 blanket by the next day. By the following night, the Army had 1,800 blankets. There was a lot of resourcefulness and creativity. Decisive action. What to do with the 10,000 unburied bodies who had died. 17,000 died in March. More than 35,000 died in the first 4 months. So he had to make a very quick decision about what to do with these bodies. And with the impending heat of summer, there was really a risk of cholera. So Hughes ordered the immediate burial of the dead in mass graves. And this haunted him, I think. 2 Jewish chaplains, deeply disturbed by the casting of emaciated bodies into the pits, beseeched Hughes. They begged him, was there not a more respectful way? But he had no choice. He really had no choice. He promised to allow them to say prayers at the sites, and he promised to help them make special appointments of chaplains and relief groups to assist. And he personally, ever after, expressed reverence for the Belsen martyrs. Compassion. On his 2nd day in the camp, while trying to grasp the extent of the crime, Hughes met a desperate doctor attending the birth of the first free child in Bergen-Belsen. The patient was in agony. Blood gushed from the womb of her typhus-infected, lice-ridden body. Running out of the barracks, Dr. Gisela Pearl had grabbed Hughes' sleeve with her filthy hands. She begged him for water and disinfectant. Within a half hour, she got what she needed to perform the operation. Moved to tears, Hughes later described his encounter with the gynecologist who did wonderful work under appalling conditions. Noting, there's so many stories like this, noting Hughes' gentleness with patients, survivors named the hotbed, the complex in the Bergen-Hone area, less than a mile from the concentration camp, the Glyn Hughes Hospital. And receptivity to unfolding phenomena. And I'll just tell you that it was really something for the liberators to see that after a few weeks, people who were mourning grave losses, right? There was no one who survived, almost no one, I should say, who hadn't lost most of their family members. As they're mourning grave losses, they're slowly coming back to their own personhood. He's seeing with nutrition, with health, with a little bit of medical care, some people are rallying, and they're showing their former personalities, who they are, and they're asking questions of the aides. And people are, the people who work with them, who had seen like really bizarre behavior at first, like they couldn't understand it, are beginning to appreciate the work, the rescue efforts, and how they are helping people. And a psychiatrist came on a few occasions to the camp, and he said he doubts that these people will ever be able to function as normal human beings again. But Glyn Hughes felt differently. He felt that most of them, depending on their own inner resources, would become reasonable citizens again. But what happened is, after his tour of duty ended, a couple of months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, he kept going back to the camp. he was very taken with what was happening. There was a formation of a displaced persons camp in Bergen-Belsen that was really extraordinary. And do I have time to tell you about it? Do I have time? Okay. So this is really so much a part of his soul-turning summer and years after the war. Whoops, wrong. So I just want to mention really quickly what my mom's part in the story is before the DP camp. My mom wasn't part of that chapter, right? She wasn't in the DP camp for very long. She was there for maybe a month or two. The Swedish government, in a humanitarian gesture, and for perhaps also some political reasons, whatever, took in about 7,000 survivors to rehabilitate them. The idea was to get them on their feet, help them heal, and within 6 months, they would be repatriated. Like everyone thought, like the British thought, they liberated the camp, they thought the people are gonna go home, they're gonna be repatriated. Of course, maybe some who were from the Western countries, maybe from France, could go home. But the people from Eastern Europe, by and large, did not want to go home. Their entire communities had been killed out. And their families, there was nothing to go home for. And on my mother's case, she's 15 years old. She's deathly ill. Her parents were murdered in Auschwitz. Her 4 younger siblings were murdered in Auschwitz. Her grandmother was murdered in Auschwitz. Almost her entire community had been stolen from her, every single thing she owned. And so she could not make a single decision for herself. She and her older sister survived, and they were taken to Sweden. Now, I just calculated this at one point because it was just interesting to me, and it's a little bit of a microcosm. It a little bit shows you who had the greatest chance of surviving, even though these were 6 survivors who went to to Sweden. These were the 174 Jews from Siget who wound up in Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war. And this is the age breakdown of those who were taken to Sweden. Now, there were some from Siget who wound up in other places who survived. But out of 13,000 people who lived in Siget in the vicinity who were deported to Auschwitz, maybe 2,000 survived. But here was 174 who were taken from Bergen-Belsen to Sweden. And again, there could have been some who survived in Bergen-Belsen who didn't go to Sweden. But of these, you can see it was almost impossible to survive if you were in your 50s. And some people were in their 30s, and there was a large number who were in the 20s age range. And my mom, in the red, was born in 1929. She was among the youngest. You can see, and my aunt, her sister, was born in 1928. And this is just one picture of my mom at the first place where she got personalized, individual, real medical care. I blew up the picture of her there, and this is pretty soon after the war. It's probably August, September 1945, and you can still see that she's quite bruised from having been beaten up, and you can see sort of the hollow look in her eyes. And this doctor in the first row, seated, second from the right, Dr. Leffler, doesn't know me, I don't know her, but she has a very special place in my heart because she nursed my mother through the night when my mother had a very high fever, and was like a mother to her and cared for her and helped her pull through. These are all survivors, surviving teenagers, but I'm going to skip now my mom's story, which is a whole separate part of my book. It's the epilogue. A lot is in the epilogue about what happens to her in Sweden. And again, the Swedish government thought after 6 months people would be repatriated, and my mom lived in Sweden for 10 years. So this is such an interesting, there's so many stories that happen around the liberation, but this is just, this was written by Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, commander of the 11th Light Field Ambulance, and this is what he wrote in his diary. And it's just like things that you don't expect or you don't think about. It was shortly after the British Red Cross arrived, though it may have no connection, that a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering around about with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips. So I will leave it to you to think about what the lipstick did for these women. And there's all kinds of stories like that. Like there's a soldier who comes in and says, look at this woman, she's crazy. She's combing her hair with a broken comb. It's like missing all the teeth. So one of the survivors pointed out to him, he said, you give her a choice between a comb like that, you give her a comb that has all its teeth and see which one she chooses, and then you tell me if she's crazy. Because they had no choice. But what started to happen that really amazed Glyn Hughes was a rebuilding, the surviving remnant, the Sherit HaPlita in Bergen-Belsen, started to organize themselves, and very quickly, people coupled up. There was an average of 6 weddings a day in Bergen-Belsen after the liberation, after people sort of came to themselves. And this was complicated, right? The war was crazy and chaotic. You didn't know if maybe you were married before. What if your spouse survived? What if they didn't survive? So here is a special Bergen-Belsen ketubah, Jewish marriage contract, that specified what to do if a loved one, a former spouse, showed up. Because 420 men and 300 women who had been married and didn't know the fates of their spouses were granted permission to remarry, with certain caveats in their ketubah, in case their former spouse showed up. And there was an enormous baby boom in history, 7 times that of the German women. By 1948, you had 36 births per 1,000 women in Bergen-Belsen, but that was 7 times the rate of the German women. The drive to recreate and rebuild and remake families was extraordinary. There was such a baby boom here, and by 1948, there were so many children. The life and social life revolved a lot around these children. And there was a lot of creativity and resourcefulness. This woman on the left was determined to get married in a white wedding gown. So her husband worked in the place where they were giving out food provisions in the DP camp. And one day, a German soldier came in, and he had no use for his worthless parachute. So for like 2 things of coffee beans and some cigarettes, this guy bought this parachute, and a seamstress in the camp fashioned this beautiful wedding gown with a big bow and back for her and a matching shirt for him for their wedding. And the woman on the right, Gina Turgell, married this Norman Turgell, one of the British liberators, and he also had a dress made for her out of British parachute material, beautiful, and they were married 6 months after the war in the town of Lübeck. And this woman, this 19-year-old survivor, found 2 sticks, and she found some old German soldiers' socks, and she unraveled the wool and knit herself this sweater. So they were just very resourceful. And also at the displaced persons camp, there was a concentration camp theater. There were people who were talented actors and actresses who assembled, and they put on these performances that were just so cathartic for the viewers. You had 2,000 people bawling their eyes out watching these performances by former inmates talking about their immediate past experiences. And then there was the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training that came to the camp, who trained men in mechanical engineering and women in sewing, and the bottom 2 right pictures of a school for dental technicians. So there was a lot going on to rehabilitate these people. And there was even a police force in the camp marching through, the Jewish police force, because at its peak, there was more than 12,000 people living here, not only survivors from Bergen-Belsen, but survivors from other camps who came here. And everybody was waiting. They were on this wait. They were waiting to begin their lives. And here's some, this is just documents from the Glyn Hughes Hospital. I just included a birth certificate, and you can see on top that this baby was the second child born to these people in the Glyn Hughes Hospital. And this, on the right, there was an artist who was there who created a series of 11 drawings while he was in the Glyn Hughes Hospital. And this one says, "We survived, what now?" And there was also a newspaper, bi-weekly newsletter that was first-hand calligraphied, and then finally the fifth version was typewritten, and it had like 27 pages. The last page was in English for the British, and the green ink was a real novelty, and this was called Our Voice. And by the way, this still exists. Like, you can still, there's now it's beautiful. It's this magazine, and it's put out by the Bergen-Belsen organization in Israel, and you can go online to see it, to see their editions. And finally, the people were united around a common goal. Whether they were religious or secular before the war, they all rallied. Most of the survivors after the war just had their sights on going to Palestine. Let us look for a future where we could be safe. The Jewish people need their own homeland. Look what happened to us. And so you have on the top left, these are soldiers from the British Brigade stationed in Palestine coming to visit and to talk to the people who are so amazed to see Jewish men in uniform. And on the right, you see that diminutive man, Yessel Rosensaft, was a real dynamo. He really organized the survivors. He was sort of the self-appointed leader of the group of survivors, and he became very close friends with Glyn Hughes, really for the rest of their lives. And here's this on the left is a group that organized themselves. They were already organizing into like a kibbutz, and they had a sports team. And on the right, you see one of the rallies at which all of the DPs are gathered together, lobbying the British. It was a real political time when they wanted to get into Palestine, and the British had their own reasons for saying, "Go get repatriated. We don't want you going to Palestine." They had their own interests in the Middle East. Whoops. And now I'm going to play you this video, if it works, hopefully. This is Rabbi Tzvi Asaria Herman Helfgott, who was young at the time that he came to Bergen-Belsen. He had gotten his rabbinical degree and PhD in 1940. He was Yugoslavian, and he was, during the war, he was the rabbi of a Yugoslavian community before the war. During the war, he was in a Yugoslavian POW camp. But as soon as the liberation happened and he learned about Bergen-Belsen, he went to the camp to see if he could be of help. So here it's in Hebrew, but there's English subtitles.
אני עברתי יום-יום מבלוק לבלוק לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשהחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן, נקבור אותה. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולל, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו ראש כל לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלסן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי בידיים. הילד האלף.
So that's really it. I had, in my epilogue, I talk more about Glyn Hughes. That's a picture of him on top at Bergen-Belsen. On the bottom, years later, he was a very great sportsman. And one of the reasons I think everyone in this room, if you haven't already, maybe one day you might be affected by certain things. There's always a chain thing, reaction. But he was one of, if you've had any experience with the hospice movement, I think that he was one of the inspirations for that. And I don't know if I would connect it, but maybe because he saw so many people died in ways they should not have died. People shouldn't, how should people leave this world? And there you have my mom when she's with her sister. They're young women in Sweden. And on the right, that's her wedding picture with my dad. And my dad was also a survivor, and that's a picture of him on the right in the DP camp photo. And that's my mom today, and she speaks about her experiences to groups all over. And that's really my presentation. I'm sorry I went a little over time.
You mentioned that your mother was sponsored. Well, perhaps you mentioned that your mother was beaten when she went back to the hut. Was there an explanation for the beating after the liberation that was happening?
Yeah, there was, but she really she would not blame any of her compatriots for beating her up. She just said that we were all animals at that point on stage.
Yes.
I
had the same question. Yeah. So the book I detail more about what, how my mother, she fell unconscious, but actually she roused a little bit and we were wondering, and she had great heartbreak there, and she had a realization how she willed herself to survive, and what she told herself, what goes through her mind. I mean, she's a kid, and when I wrote the book, I tried to remove myself, like I didn't, sometimes I didn't put myself in the book at all. I just tried to look at her, who is this child who went through these experiences, and that helped me kind of distance myself.
Thank you, Dr. Bernice.